Right. Imagine losing control of a strategic military territory, promising to pay billions for the privilege of renting it back, and then being told by your own parliament to show your workings. That's not a diplomatic masterstroke, that's a political faceplant in slow motion. Tonight, Keir Starmer's Chagos Islands deal has gone from quiet foreign policy tidy-up to full-blown Westminster spectacle. Lords revolting, costs ballooning, legal landmines everywhere, and the Prime Minister stuck explaining why Britain's giving away the keys while still paying the mortgage. Let's break down the 10 moments that turned this deal into a humiliation and why the real showdown is only just beginning. The first humiliation landed late and hard in the House of Lords, where the government's Chagos legislation was dismantled amendment by amendment like flat-pack furniture assembled by someone who skipped the instructions. Peers from across the chamber forced multiple defeats, demanding transparency, safeguards and limits that the government had not volunteered. This was not minor procedural tinkering, it was Parliament signalling that the deal, as drafted, simply was not good enough. When unelected peers feel confident enough to slap down a Prime Minister's flagship foreign policy move, it tells you the wheels are already wobbling, and that was only the opening act. And if you think this was just parliamentary nitpicking, wait until you hear what the deal actually costs. At the centre of the controversy sits a price tag so slippery even ministers appear unsure which figure they're meant to repeat. The government insists the deal will cost around £101 million per year, yet critics point to lease payments, compensation funds, inflation adjustments, and long-term commitments that could push the real cost north of £13 billion, with some estimates climbing far higher. Britain hands over sovereignty, then pays Mauritius annually to lease back Diego Garcia, a base Britain already controls. To many MPs and peers, that arrangement feels less like diplomacy and more like selling the house than asking permission to sleep in the spare room. And that spare room, by the way, just happens to house one of the most important military assets on the planet. Diego Garcia is not some forgotten coral outcrop, it is a strategic linchpin for British and American military operations across the Indian Ocean and beyond. From intelligence gathering to rapid deployment capability, the base underpins Western defense architecture. Critics argue that surrendering sovereignty introduces long-term risk, regardless of leasing guarantees written into the treaty. The Lords backed amendments allowing Britain to suspend payments if the base becomes unusable, a clause ministers initially resisted. That resistance raised eyebrows. If the base truly is secure, why oppose a basic insurance policy? Defense logic, it seems, collided head-first with political pride. But military strategy is only half the storm. The human story beneath it is far messier. The Chagossian people, forcibly removed from their homeland decades ago, remain the moral fault line running straight through this deal. Peers backed calls for greater consultation, transparency, and even a referendum involving Chagossians living in the UK and abroad. Critics argue it is deeply contradictory to champion self-determination globally while denying it here. Ministers counter that there is no permanent population on the islands, conveniently ignoring why that is. The Lords were not convinced, and neither are campaigners, who view the deal as repeating historical injustice under a modern diplomatic gloss. And when morality wobbles, lawyers are never far behind. Legal pressure is mounting alongside political resistance. Judicial reviews challenging the deal are already moving through the courts, questioning whether the government has acted lawfully, proportionately, and transparently. Peers were particularly alarmed by the government's original timetable, which risked ratifying the treaty before judicial rulings were delivered. That sequencing alone raised constitutional concerns. The forced delay now aligns parliamentary scrutiny with court decisions, an outcome ministers did not plan but cannot ignore. When legislation must pause to avoid being legally embarrassing, it rarely inspires confidence in its foundations. Meanwhile, across the Commons, opposition parties scenting blood.
Politically, the backlash has been ferocious. Conservatives branded the defeats humiliating, accusing Labour of weakening national security while committing taxpayers to eye-watering costs. Liberal Democrats pushed for democratic input from Chagossians, while smaller parties openly questioned whether a future government would even honour the treaty. Instead of neutralising a long-running dispute, Starmer has handed opponents a ready-made attack line: sovereignty surrendered, money squandered, and scrutiny dodged. In Westminster terms, that is a trifecta no Prime Minister wants attached to their name this early. Yet the real damage may lie not in opposition attacks, but in unease closer to home. Within government circles, discomfort is growing. The deal was meant to close a chapter inherited from years of international pressure, including advisory rulings urging Britain to relinquish control. Instead, it has reopened every argument at once. Questions over costings, consultation and security now dominate headlines, distracting from broader policy goals. When foreign policy becomes a domestic liability, Downing Street usually scrambles, and that scramble is now visible. Allies may accept reassurances, but voters notice when explanations start sounding rehearsed rather than convincing. And voters are not the only audience watching closely. Internationally, the optics matter. Britain has long positioned itself as a defender of rules-based order and lawful decolonisation, yet this deal, critics argue, exposes tension between principle and pragmatism. Leasing back a base while paying billions risks appearing transactional rather than ethical. Supporters say the treaty restores credibility abroad. Skeptics argue it signals weakness. Either way, the Lord's intervention ensures the world is now watching a very public renegotiation. Diplomacy conducted under parliamentary floodlights rarely runs smoothly. Which brings us neatly to the final battleground: what happens next? The legislation now returns to the House of Commons burdened with amendments that demand accountability, which the government tried to avoid. Ministers must decide whether to overturn them, negotiate compromises, or risk further rebellion. Each option carries a political cost. Push too hard and accusations of arrogance follow. Concede too much and the deal begins to unravel. The showdown looming is not merely procedural, it is existential for the policy itself. This is no longer about tidying up history, it is about surviving the present. And looming over everything is a simple question Starmer still hasn't answered cleanly. Why rush a deal that creates more problems than it solves? That question echoes through every debate, amendment and interview. Supporters insist delay risks international fallout. Critics counter that haste has already caused domestic damage. The Lord's message was blunt: transparency first, sovereignty respected, costs justified, people consulted. Whether the government listens will define how this episode is remembered, as a necessary correction or as a stubborn march into unavoidable defeat. Either way, the Chagos deal has become a political lesson written in bold ink. If you want sharp breakdowns that cut through the spin, unpack the power plays and explain what Westminster is really doing behind closed doors, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel and drop your thoughts in the comments. This story is far from finished and neither is the scrutiny.